Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about feminist challenges to sociology, and in particular I'm going to give some ideas about the work of Dorothy E. Smith, who is a Canadian feminist sociologist. Also run through a few changes that feminist sociology has brought to sociology, and also want to review Barbara Risman's theory of gender structure in action. She has a theory and then she's applied that theory to some research that she's done. So, to start with Dorothy E. Smith, she's had a very long and distinguished career as an academic. She's been very much shaped by the women's liberation movement, which was sparked, some would say, by the publication of Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminist Mystique. And in that book, Betty Friedan talked about the problem that has no name, the situation of many middle-class American women who gave up their education, their careers, to stay at home and raise children, which for many of them was a very stifling occupation. And the book did become a bestseller. So I just want to say there that there always have been women in the workforce. They've always, working class women, for example, have always needed to be in the workforce. So we're talking about women who didn't need to, for financial reasons, need to be out doing paid work. And the culture was very much that women should stay at home if they were able financially to do that. Informed by the women's movement, Dorothy Smith began to notice something strange about her own experience. She was actually born, I think I said she's Canadian, but in actual fact, she was born in England. She had her PhD, she did that from the University of California, Berkeley. But in 1967, she moved to Vancouver and taught at the University of British Columbia. And then a bit later on in 1977, she moved to Toronto, and she was working there in the Institute for Studies in Education. So she noticed that, so we're now talking at the beginning of her career as a sociologist, and we're talking about California and then later on Canada, where she would go to work as a sociologist, you know, doing her PhD and then a little bit later on. And what she observed in herself is that she had two modes of consciousness, two ways of being in the world, and she called this a bifurcated consciousness. So she had her work as an academic, and what she noticed that it was organized textually, and by that I mean she was always reading books or writing books, reading papers or writing papers. And it was also organized conceptually, very much focused on ideas and theories. And it seemed to her to be independent of the local in particular. And she noticed that because her life as a single mother, where she cleaned, prepared and cooked food, put children to bed, she had two small boys, played with them, got mad at them. It was a whole life of particulars, a particular park she went to, particular illnesses that she and her children had, particular walks that the family went on. And what she noticed was that she really liked going from that academic setting and then coming down to earth in this other life that she had as a mother. And so that's what she called bifurcated consciousness. She saw that when she went to work, she was also transgressing a gender boundary. So in her work as an academic, it was an intellectual world which actually appeared genderless, but when you took a little bit more notice, there were more than 40 men working there and only 2 women, and those 2 women were on temporary contracts. And that it was very much a male world in all of its assumptions, interests, perspectives, discourses. So women were the other. In her life as a single mother, however, that was very much a time where women's work was as the nurturers and carers. So we're talking back in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And that she called the gender boundary, dividing those two worlds, that bifurcated consciousness. On the one hand, her life as a single mother, which was down to earth, was very much a female domain, and her work, her abstract work in the university, was very much a male domain. She then went on to talk about, and she's written about this over a number of years, the relations of ruling. And she's interested in the intersection of the institutions which do the organising and regulating of society, and their gender subtext and their basis in a gender division of labour. And by ruling, she means the government, law, business, economics, finance, management, all professional organisations, our educational institutions, and the various discourses that we have in text and document. And it's the practice of the rule that standardises, makes general, that particular and local. So when we read a book, we're talking about a large group of people, and they are kind of all generalised. And then we're standardised. Think about the education system, for example, that standardises students, even think down to, and I'm thinking up to at least the end of high school. Think also even of the standardisation in terms of the clothes that you wear. But so it standardises things that otherwise are quite particular and local. So the government, administration, all of that management work is done via communication. Therefore, the ruling is done via words, numbers, images on paper, these days, of course, in computers, or on the TV screen, or on movie screens. And it's written and organised by people like me, academics, teachers, journalists, writers, filmmakers, publishers, advertisers, etc. And it shapes how we think about ourselves, how we think about other people, and think about that in the context of the conversation that's been going on in Australia around the terrorist attack in Christchurch, and the implications for the larger context of the talk of politicians around immigration and Muslims, and the way in which Muslims have often been represented in the media. So it can shape how we think about ourselves and others, how we should look, our homes, how we live, and what we think. All of sociology, she says, is implicated in the relations of ruling, but sociologists have the power to describe, to analyse, and to categorise, which in turn then contributes to society. So she's talking about sociology particularly here, and women were left out of that. So sociology is part of the relations of ruling. And gender, she says, is invisible because the relations of ruling are, of course, objectified, impersonal, and they claim universality. So men claim to represent the masculine and the neutral. They stand in for mankind or humanity, and women get confined to the subjective. So she writes, we are looking at a gender organisation of the apparently neutral and impersonal rationality of the ruling apparatus. The male subtext concealed beneath its apparently impersonal forms is integral but not accidental. Women were excluded from the practices of power within these textually mediated relations of ruling. And she says that authority is a form of power. It is about the capacity to get things done, and men have authority as members of a group. So they're invested with authority as individuals through that membership, and invested with authority of institutionalised structures as well. And she writes, this is why we have a sociology that is written from the perspective of positions in a male-dominated ruling class, and is set up in terms of the relevances of the institutional power structures that constitute these positions. So she's arguing, of course, for a sociology for women, and she has this metaphor of a dance, that we can join a dance, move with the dance, but we can't see how the dance was organised actually in the first place. So a sociology from the standpoint of women as outside the extra-local relations of ruling is what's needed. And the everyday world, therefore, becomes the focus of sociological attention. It becomes problematic, which is the name of one of her books. So in our research, we begin with the everyday world, which is local, particular, embodied, and of course has an historical context as well. But we don't stay there. We extend our analysis out to make visible the relations of ruling as well. So as an example, she gives an example of how a working class woman in England during the 20th century, so of her every day. So she's called Mrs. T, and her daily life is structured around organisations or these relations of ruling that are beyond her narrow domestic world. It's not organised in the way that she might want it organised. Instead, it's organised around her husband's job. She's responsible for getting him fed and off to work, getting him dinner when he gets in for work. But she doesn't decide when her husband goes to work. That's decided externally or extra-locally. It's organised also around her children's schooling. She gets the children up and fed and off to school. She makes them lunch. She brings them back home. And gives them food when they return home at the end of the day. And those times are organised by educational institutions, not by her. Even the fact that the children have to go to school is organised externally to her. And she has to do at home the homework, or facilitate the homework that the school sets for her child as well. So this is all done, of course, at a particular point in historical time, and it'll be affected by historical changes. So there was a time, of course, when children didn't go off to school, and then they went to school for half a day, and then they went to school for a whole day, and then they went to school until they were 13, then 15, now 17, I'm thinking there of mandatory schooling ages. So most of that woman's day is organised by the ruling relations, which are external to her, and she has to organise her day around that, not choose it for herself. So since, and she of course wasn't the only one, but since Dorothy Smith's time, there has been quite a lot of work done in sociology, and feminist sociology has certainly drawn on feminist debates on sexual difference. And there's various traditions there as well. So that there is humanism, which emphasises sameness rather than difference. Gynocentrism, which where the emphasis is on different and celebrated. Postmodernism, where we critically reflect on difference. And critical feminism, which is kind of alliances, I guess, between women and men in struggles against oppression. And it's been informed by a whole lot of different feminist theoretical perspectives, and I'm sure that you're familiar with these: the idea of liberal or reformist feminist theory, radical feminism, Marxist feminism, which we've talked about briefly, dual systems or socialist feminism, postmodern feminism, feminist critical theory, and black and post-colonial feminism. So sociology is very different now to when Dorothy Smith came in. 30 years later, it is still a male-dominated field of study. If you look at most of the books and academic papers produced, and the figures who are very dominant, but mostly we have female students. That issue of sexual difference is no longer ignored, and I've taken this from Abbott Wallace and Tyler's work on feminist sociology, and I guess that's, 2005, that's getting a little bit old, so maybe that's changed. But they contended that studies continued to focus on men and boys, ignoring women and girls, or adding women and girls without changing theories. And feminist thought too often seen as an addendum, an option instead of a core, as something that female lecturers teach. And certainly that was my experience as a student, that it was added in unless you were taking women's studies courses or gender studies courses. And of course we have seen the rise of men's studies and gender studies and the decline of women's studies now right across the world. Sociology 30 years later, feminist perspectives have definitely made a difference. What's included now are studies around sexuality in the body, identity and difference, and visual and cultural sociology, which weren't there or not much previously. And feminist sociology has had an impact as well in terms of what we might be studying. So a lot more work on health and illness, family and domestic work, employment and organisation, and how that impacts education, crime and deviance, age and the life course, and the mass media, and how that impacts on us. So it's certainly those feminist perspectives are across all of those areas, and has transformed, I think, sociology. There are still concerned that feminist perspectives are not incorporated into issues of social class and stratification, although of course Beverly Skeggs in the United Kingdom has done quite a bit of work around that. That when it comes to political sociology, that we're not using much in the way of feminist perspectives, and the same with sociological theory as well. So perhaps we'll have a discussion about what you think about that on your travels through sociology classes in the University of Adelaide. So there's kind of been three responses to this feminist challenge to sociology. There's the idea of integration, separatism, and reconceptualization. So integration is about reforming existing ideas and approaches. The main problem with that is that often women continue to be marginalised. The idea of separatism tends to continue the marginalisation of women, but it also celebrates it. So, what's called male stream sociology is left to do the real sociology, and we can't ignore men or ignore the ways in which men dominate, exploit and subordinate women. So there are issues with separatism as well. Reconceptualization emphasizes the reconstruction of sociology, which means that what we want is a total rethinking so that women are incorporated adequately. But there are many sociologists who are resistant to this idea. And if you have any doubt about that, then I'd suggest having a look at some textbooks. There are definitely feminist sociological textbooks, and I've mentioned one of those earlier. That's a little bit dated now. I haven't found anything that's kind of a bit more up to date. But many of the other textbooks, honestly, they're just, and I was required to teach a course a few years ago, and this course was initially based on really just a list of men, and that's not intended to offend any men in the audience, but it is to say, come on, that's ridiculous. We can't possibly be teaching sociology at third year with just this list of male theorists. And most, if not all of those men came from North America and Europe to boot, so it was very narrow. So now I just want to introduce Barbara Risman, if you haven't come across her already, and her idea of gender as a social structure. And she's an example, I think, of rethinking sociology. She was born in 1956, and she was the child of Jewish migrants to the United States, continuing what I see as a pattern of Jewish scholars within the tradition anyway. She's currently head of sociology at the University of Illinois in Chicago, which is a very nice connection with our Chicago school. And her theory is drawn on in a number of studies that she's done, hooking up culture, men, cooking, sexual violence, housework, etc. So what she says is that as societies have a political structure and an economic structure, they also have a gender structure. And by gender structure, she means the way in which bodies are assigned a sex category, usually female and male, from which gender as inequality is built. And a gender structure therefore has implications for individuals and their identities, their personalities, and therefore the choices they make. And she suggests doing analyses at three levels of this gender structure: the individual level, the interactional level, and we talked about that in terms of symbolic interactionism last week. And in there she'd be thinking about cultural expectations, taken for granted meanings that we have. Often we have taken it, less so now, but often it has been taken for granted that it would be women, for example, who would stay home and be the primary carer of children. And then at another level, so you can see the macro level influencing both the individual level and the interactional level with socialization and cultural expectation. And then at another level, she says we need to look at institutions, and we need to consider the distribution of material advantage, how organisations are actually organised, and the discourses. And I think that you can see feminists have been doing some of that. And thinking about the material advantage, for example, the gender pay gap is an example of that. So you can see that her ideas are not uncommon anymore. We've certainly taken them on board, and they've been spread through other theorists as well. She reckons that while people have long focused at that individual level, of course the gender structure goes well beyond that. And so while we would do analysis of bodywork, for example, at that individual level, every time we meet another person or even imagine in our minds an encounter, there are expectations attached to our sex category, and we're held accountable to those expectations whether we meet them or not. So that's at that middle level, the interactional level of analysis. And things to be looking for in doing an analysis are access to social networks, proportionate representation, which we hear a lot of in Australia, particularly around, at the moment, the number of women who are in Parliament, stereotypes, cognitive bias, othering, etc. However, and that other level, the macro level, we'll also need to consider religion. That's, of course, come up quite a bit recently in terms of the terrorist attack in Christchurch, our legal system, all of which, of course, have been patriarchal, have been based on men ruling, men dominating the relations of ruling. And all of which have beliefs about male privilege and agency on the one hand, and about women as nurturers and carers. So that is why we need to consider the distribution of those material resources, and why it is that if you're in unpaid work staying at home, you're unlikely to be getting paid for doing work that actually has a value to the community and to the economy as well, according to some. So Barbara Risman uses this theory to analyse millennials as emerging adults. So young adults at this particular historical moment, when young people stay at home for longer as a general rule, often well into their 20s, even into their 30s. The social processes involved in this very long transition to adulthood in American society, because she is American, is more individuated today and includes a whole lot of identity work as a feature, particularly including identity struggles around sexuality and gender. So what she did was use life history interviews done in 2013 of a sample of 116 young people in America. They were aged between 18 and 30. They were living in and around the city of Chicago. They were mostly college students or recent graduates. Slightly less than a third were male, the rest were female, and in the group there were 3 trans women and 3 trans men. The group were ethnically diverse. They were white dominated with 43%, 9% black, 22% Asian, 17% who identified as Latino, and about 88%, which was a mix of others, mostly from the Middle East. Of the group, 72% identified as heterosexual, 11% identified as gay, 22% as a mix of other sort of sexual identities, including bisexual, queer, pansexual, etc. Wasn't very class diverse. Most of the group were first generation college students from working class backgrounds. She ended up dividing up her group into, after analysing their life histories, dividing them up into 4 groups. And first of all, there were what she calls the true believers, and the number of those was 30 in the sample. And she says at this macro level, I guess the word she would use is at that institutional level, gender just is and should be. This is for the true believers. This group believe in the gender ideology that women and men should be different, and often there's a religious component, and they accept religious rules regarding gender segregation and differentiation. And often that's sort of called women are different but equal. And there's certainly been lots of arguments within theology and religious studies arguing against whether it's possible for women to be different and yet equal. But that is one of the concerns, particularly, and I think within most religious faiths as well, not just within what's called the Abrahamic religions. At the next level down, the interactional level, so this is where we're having interactions with other people and coming up against their expectations. This group generally experienced intentional gender-specific socialisation. So they were socialised around this thing that women and men should be different, and that there should be at times gender segregation. And they did, so not only were they experiencing quite intentional socialisation around that, but there was also lots of gender policing to reinforce that socialisation as well. So for example, if a little girl did want to get her hair cut short, then she would be told that that's not appropriate for a girl. At the individual level, so thinking about them as individual people, then she found that they tended to internalise gender not as a structure, but as a personality trait. And they tended to carefully follow gendered behavioural norms as well. And they don't like their bodies, but she found that within other groups as well. But in this group, that was quite a strong finding. The next group were the innovators with a number of 21. At that macro level, she found these young people were consistently critical of the gender structure. They reject gender essentialism, saying that we are essentially different. They rejected sexism. At the interactional level, though, they do feel constrained by expectations around gender. Men experienced gender policing, and that was mostly around what they did, around their behaviour. So if they wanted to play with dolls, for example, as children, then they would get told off for that. Women experienced gender policing, and that was mostly around their appearance. So if they were inappropriately wearing a short haircut, for example, or that was seen as inappropriate. They were actually trying to define new expectations about gender for themselves and for others in interaction with others. As individuals, at the individual level, what they did was reject cultural beliefs in sexism. They tended to mix and match gendered behaviours. So men, for example, rejected hegemonic masculinity. Women might reject hyper-femininity. They don't reject, however, the material embodiment of how they present themselves as female or male. Then she had the rebels, which was a smaller group, and the number of those was 17. 10 of this group did identify as genderqueer. They reject gender as a binary, rejecting womanhood and manhood, femininity and masculinity, as they are currently defined in the gender structure. So at that macro level, they reject the gender structure. They feel oppressed by social institutions because of the gender structure, and they held change the world views. That's what they wanted to do, change the world. At the interaction level, what they did was experience very high levels of gender policing, but they also had a commitment to pushing back against the gender binary. So they were resisting that policing they were encountering. And at the individual level, they rejected social expectations for the way in which they presented their bodies, and they lived between the binary of female and male. They also tended to mix and match from traditionally female and male personality traits and behaviours as well. And in her last group, which was a very large group of 48, she had a group that she called the straddlers. And this group held contradictory beliefs. They weren't always consistent. So at the macro level, they're actually not sure really any more of what's expected of them. Interestingly, men didn't experience social institutions as gendered. At the interaction level, men still expected to be a breadwinner, and they experienced a lot of gender policing by their peers. So around expressing their feelings, what they wore, what sort of sport or other activities they engaged in, what they did, their behaviour. Women were very much socialised to be feminine, were expected to be pretty. They had far less in their families, they had far less freedom than their brothers. They expected to do well at school though and have a career. And at the individual level, they lived within the rules, but also rejected some, and that because they really, unlike the rebels, they really don't want to make waves. So that's why she called them the straddlers. She does stress in her book, which is on the reading list for the book review if you're interested, she does stress that none of these groups are neat and tidy. But it wasn't really hard for me to imagine how you could do this sort of study within Australia, for example, and come up with perhaps very similar findings. So this is where Barbara Risman ends up. She's calling for a social movement for freedom from gender. What she wants to do is make overt genderism unacceptable. She wants us to experiment with institutions in a post-gender way. She wants no correlation between sex at birth and then gendered expectations. And she wants new gender-free pronouns for us all. And she really wants feminist scholarship to go beyond women's studies and gender studies programs, which in some ways it does, in other ways it doesn't. So, in sum, for this week, sociology has changed and definitely incorporated ideas from feminist scholars. Dorothy Smith was absolutely in the vanguard of changes to sociology, and Barbara Risman's Gender as Social Structure is an example of rethinking sociology. So thanks very much for listening.